Yes, marks 20 years of this platform, and it is a matter of great pride for all of us at TERI that all of you speakers and delegates have been able to join us for this important milestone edition. Your support is instrumental in the success of the platform and our efforts. I am delighted to welcome you all to the thematic track today titled Decarbonizing South Asia, that focuses on low carbon transition and decarbonization of economies in the South Asia region. The objective of this session is to discuss possible pathways for South Asian countries to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 while ensuring a just transition. This session is divided into two parts. The first is an introductory session followed by a presentation session, and then we will have a panel discussion. I would now like to invite Mr. RR Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow, for his welcome remarks. So, over to you.
Very good afternoon. Very good afternoon to all of you, to all the participants. Today we are going to discuss this issue of decarbonizing in South Asia, and on this occasion, on behalf of TERI and the WSDS, let me extend a very warm welcome to all the participants in today's webinar. I particularly am thankful to the World Bank for extending its support to TERI and to the larger community in the South Asian region for advancing discussion on this topic of global importance and extreme significance for climate change efforts globally and also regionally. You know, the South Asian region is particularly important in any climate dynamics in any way that we can think of. It is home to some of the largest economies in the world and also some of the fastest growing economies. At the same time, it's also the economies and the countries in this region are extremely vulnerable, while they also are regarded as now the key countries which lie at the heart of solution to the global crisis in climate. The questions which arise in the context of decarbonization in the global context, they're also particularly true in the context of South Asian region, and perhaps with a much greater degree of intensity, because the problems in this region are vastly different from the rest of those economies where decarbonization is also taking place and is being regarded as a challenge. The challenge in these economies arises from the fact that the energy demand is growing and growing at a very fast pace compared to the rest of the world. Now, only yesterday or 2 days ago, when the International Economic Agency released its report or India Energy Outlook on quarter 1, it underlined this fact that the energy demand in India, particularly, which is one of the large countries in this region, it has doubled since 2000. And by 2030, it's likely to increase by another 50%. In fact, the rate of growth in India is going to be almost 3 times that of the global average. And the global average may be a little low because the rate is evened out when we combine the rates across the world in developed and developing economies. But the fact remains that the energy demand in countries in the South Asian region, which are home to 1/5 of the total global population, and amongst the fastest growing countries in the world, naturally the demand is going to grow. So far, so the question is, in a global scenario where we are thinking of solving the global crisis of climate change, and we are looking at decarbonization as one of the key solutions, mitigating emissions, how are we going to marry these twin goals of development as well as curbing the emissions? UNEP GAP report says that if we don't do anything, we are likely to hit the 3-degree uh, level sometime in the near future. So therefore, it is important for every country to contribute, every region to contribute its might to the global efforts to climate change. And this contribution should not be only in the area of mitigation, but also in adaptation and building resilience. But for this entire range of actions, decarbonization is extremely critical because that is what will give strength to the development strategy of these countries as well as the global efforts for climate change. What shape these strategies should take is a question which we will all need to discuss in great depth in our own country. For example, in the context of energy transition, the solar has or the renewable energy has been given the a very important space. You must have heard the Prime Minister talk yesterday about 450 gigawatts of renewable energy being added to the energy generation capacity in the country by 2030. But at the same time, the key thing is that even today, when India has added almost 38% of its total electricity generation capacity from renewables, the contribution in terms of energy, actual energy generation, is only 4%. And the rest of the almost more than 70% of the energy demand is being met by coal and oil. And this situation is likely to continue if we do not take very strong measures for further decarbonization. So where is this gap in terms of supply strategy, in terms of demand management strategy? Is there something which we lack? And I think we need to look at the sectors very closely. We need to look at the renewable energy itself, the solar and wind energy, the electric vehicles in transport, the use of energy in agriculture, in the water sector, maybe the harder to abate sectors like industries, cement and steel, where there are no solutions immediately available. So we maybe have to think about shift to hydrogen economy and how to bring down the costs across the board, whether we use regulatory frameworks or whether we use technological innovations and bring down the costs through appropriate business models. We will have to think about all kinds of possible solutions in order to equip the countries to meet the increasing energy demands and at the same time meet the larger goals of decarbonization for global efforts for addressing climate change. The objective of our entire exercise needs to look at the extensive range of solutions aimed not only at mitigation but also building resilience for the vulnerable communities. And we need to build strategies which are not only short term but also long term. All the countries across the world have their NDCs, and so have the countries in this region as well. They have expressed their NDCs, but these are, of course, strategies for the short term. We will need to think about strategies for the long term, and that is the key deliverable which we need to think about. How can we build a long-term strategy for decarbonization, which also builds resilience and creates adequate space for development of the vulnerable populations? So I'll stop here, and I wish good luck to all the participants and the panelists for discussion today on this great and issue of great significance not only for our region, but for the world at large. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for setting the context for today's discussion. I would now like to invite Mr. Stephane Hallegatte, lead economist, World Bank, to give a presentation on deep decarbonization pathways and overarching framework. Mr. Hallgate is a lead economist with the climate change group of the World Bank, and his research interests include the economics of natural disasters and risk management, climate change adaptation, urban policies and economy, climate change mitigation, and green growth. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank to all of you for organizing this event and for inviting me. Thanks in particular to RR Rashmi for the introduction. I think this was an excellent way of setting the scene, and you basically said everything I wanted to stress in my remarks. I'll try to go a little bit in the details, but the point you made about combining decarbonization with development and taking into account not only the demands of today, but also the demand of tomorrow in a growing economy, all the questions about technologies and taking into account the fact that the technologies we'll have tomorrow are better than the technology we have today. I think those are very, very important considerations. So let me share my my screen now and start really from the very beginning. So the fact that to achieve those global goals that we have given ourselves in the Paris Agreement, we have not to reduce carbon emissions a little bit, but to reduce carbon emissions by 100%. And because what we want to do is so drastic, what we need to do over the short term is different in nature, and especially we have to keep in mind this long-term goal as we design the short-term strategy. A lot of people would find this objective maybe overly ambitious, but the good news is, and I'm sorry for the noise in the background, it's time for the kids to go to school, unfortunately. But we have a good sense of how we can achieve zero emissions. We know that it takes four things. It takes the decarbonization of electricity generation. It takes shifting the fuels we use and use much more electricity in everything we do. It takes much more efficiency in all sectors, and especially buildings, transport, and agriculture. And it takes working on natural carbon sinks so that we keep the carbon in the soil and in the forest. So this is what we need to do. How to do that? There are two things I want to stress in this presentation. The first one is that it takes a lot of time to change an economic system, and we need to design the short-term approach around this problem of inertia to make sure we have the time to make the transformation we need. You probably know these type of images where you have different options to reduce emissions, from the cheapest to the most expensive. And basically what you're doing is, if you want to reduce emission by a certain amount, you just select the cheapest option. And this is what people think when they talk about low-hanging fruits. We would start with what is cheap. And what I want to convince you of today is that this is not the right approach for the problem we have. And for that, imagine a situation where you have cheap emission reduction energy, a little bit more expensive in transport and buildings, and more expensive in industries. And for 2030, you have a target that is consistent with reducing emission in energy only. If you're thinking about low-hanging fruits, what you will do is, between now and 2030, work only on your energy system. But if your target for 2050 requires you to do also all the actions in transport and buildings, you find yourself in 2030 with 20 years to retrofit all of your buildings and transport infrastructure. And at that point, you will wish you had started earlier. So when we look now at this challenge, we cannot look only at our 2030 strategy. We need to look also at the longer term goals. And it really requires that we have a long-term strategy in our mind to guide our actions. So there is one way of illustrating this that I've been using quite a lot. Imagine that your end goal is to build this massive building, what you're starting with is not by building a small house, which are the low-hanging fruits. What you need to start with is to build the foundation of this big building. And we have to think about the short-term NDC exactly in the same way. The goal of the NDC is not only to reduce emission at the lowest possible costs, it is to build the foundation for long-term decarbonization. And it means working in all sectors. The second thing I want to stress is the fact that technologies are changing fast, very, very fast. And when we think about the long-term strategy, we cannot assume that the technologies we will have are the same we have today. You probably know this curve that was published 20 years ago. It was showing on the left the cheap option to reduce emission, and on the right the expensive ones. And if you look at this figure, it's 20-year-old. You see solar, photovoltaic, and wind. And on the right, at this point, it was considered really expensive, and it was really expensive to reduce emissions with solar PV and windmills. If you're focused on your low-hanging fruits, you wouldn't have touched them. It's too expensive. Let's start with the cheapest options. Yet, what happened is we invested in those technologies, and today, wind and yellow, you see this map showing the cheapest source of electricity in various countries. All of the blue and the yellow are places where wind or solar are the cheapest ways of producing electricity today. So you see that because we invested in the expensive things, we could bring the costs down, and today we have created for ourselves very cheap solutions. You know probably these curves that show that the cost of technologies are declining with how much we invest in them. We did it for solar PV, and the cost keeps declining. Today, we can imagine that we will do much more of that. This figure shows the emissions in the top 6 emitters. Among those emitters, you have China, the US, the EU, Japan, and even South Korea, who have committed to net zero carbon emission in 2050 and 2060. All of those big economies can be expected to invest in zero carbon technologies. So we can expect to bring down the costs of those technologies in the next decades. Today, we're almost there for electric vehicles. This is what you see on the left here. On the right, you see the costs of batteries also dropping very fast. All of that means that zero carbon power system, for instance, which sounded extremely challenging 10 or 20 years ago, now seems much, much more realistic. And as we have by 2025 or around that date, electric vehicles cheaper than gasoline vehicles, then we can also shift in the transport sector and use more of this zero carbon electricity. My point here being that when we look at our long-term strategy, we have to take into account the fact that technologies will be cheaper, new technologies will be available. But we also have to take into account the fact that there is an uncertainty on those technologies, and the uncertainty on which technologies will have really needs to be at the heart of how we design our long-term strategy. So having in mind the need to take into account the time it takes to do things, we cannot retrofit all buildings in 20 years. We need to take more time than that. And the need to take into account technological changes. How do we propose to address that problem? So what we have, what we are proposing now is to use sort of a backward approach where we start from a long-term strategy. So we need a long-term vision for the economy in 2050. And as Dr. Rashmi was saying, we need that vision to combine what we want to achieve in economic terms, universal access to energy, water and sanitation, tertiary education, healthcare, and decarbonization. And then we need to transform this long-term vision into a pathway in each of the sectors. What do we need to see in energy? What do we need to see in buildings? What do we need to see in transport? What do we need to see in industry? and we can transform those pathways into policy priorities for the very short term. And of course, those policy priorities and those investment needs need to be connected with national development plans, because this challenge of decarbonization is a development challenge. And I'll conclude on one idea. You see that I'm talking about robust long-term vision for 2050, and I'm talking about robust long-term visions because we cannot afford our long-term vision to be completely dependent on one technology being available. You know that a lot of people are talking about hydrogen and the potential of hydrogen to solve a lot of our problems, especially in heavy industries. At the same time, some other people think that carbon capture and sequestration is more likely to solve the problem for heavy industries. And there are other ideas on the table. As we design our short-term priorities, we have to make sure we're not putting ourselves in a position of being very vulnerable if one of these technology doesn't achieve the potential we think it will. So we cannot have a development strategy that absolutely needs to have carbon capture and sequestration, because we're not sure we'll have that. So as we develop those long-term strategies, we give a lot of thoughts about the robustness of those strategies and how they can achieve their objectives, even if the technologies that we expected are not there. And once we have that, it's relatively straightforward to transform these long-term ideas into short-term priorities. So this is basically the principles. And now I turn the floor back to you and Mani to discuss more specific issues on the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Hallgate, for your presentation and your insights on the opportunities and challenges for pathways of decarbonization. May I now invite Dr. Muthukumara Mani, lead economist, World Bank, for his presentation on decarbonizing South Asia possible approaches. He's the lead economist in the South Asia Chief Economist's Office, and he works primarily on climate change mitigation, adaptation, water, and environmental issues in the region. Over to you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Mani, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen now?
Yes. Could you please make it full screen?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much again for the invitation for this interesting session. I look forward to getting some very useful feedback. So following up on Stephane's very interesting presentation, I would like to now do a deep dive onto South Asia, where we are actually proposing to start a regional study on decarbonizing South Asia. We all know that South Asia is highly vulnerable to climate change, as Rashmiji was mentioning. If you take any global indicator of vulnerability, you'll always find 3 or 4 South Asian countries showing up there. So it's all the more reason for South Asian countries to make sure that the Paris Agreement goals are met. So the stakes are very high for South Asian countries to ensure that the global agreement on climate change stays and is implemented in the right earnest. South Asia is not a major player as far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned. It was responsible for about 8% in 2017 through 2019, and it's expected to go up to 13% in 2030. Of course, within South Asia, India is the largest contributor, accounting for 81%, followed by Bangladesh and Pakistan, which are also increasing their carbon footprint mainly because of the coal-fired power plants that they are implementing. Within South Asia, energy sector is the major contributor, followed by agriculture. So with the increasing economic growth, that's the economies are expected to recover after COVID, and urbanization and industrialization that's going to happen in South Asia, the greenhouse gas emissions are expected to further increase, making South Asia, or at least India, a major player in the global agreement. Recently, a number of countries have adopted what we can call as net zero commitments or carbon neutrality commitments by mid-century. And the good news is that these commitments are very close to the 2 degrees or at least 1.5 degree pathways that have been proposed under the Paris Agreement. So clearly, at least commitment-wise, we are, especially after the new US administration has come into place, we are moving in the right direction as far as climate change is concerned. So given that major players have some kind of a net zero emission target, there will be increasing pressure on South Asian countries and especially India to take on some kind of net zero or carbon neutrality target by mid-century. At the same time, one can argue that although these net zero emission targets or decarbonization goals are needed from a climate change perspective, but one could also argue that it is a win-win situation as far as more sustainable growth pathways is concerned. Decarbonization not only will promote climate goals, but also has a number of local benefits in terms of, for example, reducing air pollution and then that resulting in attending health benefits and so on and so forth. So it is in the interest of South Asian countries to decouple economic growth from the unsustainable pressures that eventually could lead to global climate change or even to some local environmental problems. But at the same time, it's easier said than done in the sense that decarbonizing the economy, moving away from, say, coal, which let's say accounts for 70% of your energy generation, is not going to be easy. That's going to have huge implications for jobs. It's going to have huge implications for stranded assets in case, for example, you want to move away from the coal assets, the oil and gas assets that you have to more to other sources of energy production. So we need to keep in mind that yes, the low carbon transition or so-called decarbonization is a good idea. It has a number of co-benefits, especially from an environmental point of view, from a health point of view, from an economic point of view. But at the same time, we need to be a bit careful in terms of the pathways because it has broader implications from jobs and stranded assets perspective. The good news is that all South Asian countries have some kind of a target. They all have signed on to the Paris Agreement. So clearly, their commitment is there in order to move towards a low carbon future. In the World Bank, we are also launching a South Asia Climate Action Plan with both short-term and medium-term strategies, not only decarbonize South Asian economies, but also to build resilience across various sectors, including infrastructure, agriculture, and human development. So, as I mentioned, we are embarking on this new major flagship study on decarbonizing South Asia. The main objective is to discuss the possible pathways for South Asian countries to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 while ensuring a just transition. But beyond supporting the implementation of NDCs and decarbonization goals, the focus of these pathways will also be on to identify short, medium, and long-term strategies that can positively influence attainment of economic growth and societal objectives. So clearly, the importance, of course, is that decarbonization should be accompanied by positive impact on economic growth, jobs, and so on. And especially an important area where we need to understand more, of course, is the area of jobs. Clearly, South Asian economies, they need to create more jobs, and especially in order to get millions of people above poverty line. So clearly, when you are talking about a just transition, it also implies that any new investment that you undertake, they also create enough jobs. And also, if you're transitioning away from coal, you need to make sure that the people who are previously employed in the fossil fuel sectors are able to transition to clean energy jobs. There are a number of global studies that have looked at how many jobs can be created if you scale up investment in renewable energy. The news is good in the sense that a number of studies are showing actually that investments in renewable energy can create a number of jobs to compensate for the loss that we will face in the fossil fuel sectors. But at the same time, it is really important that we understand how this is going to work in the South Asian countries as well. Transition risks or the risks from stranded assets, for example, is another issue that we need to tackle going forward, in the sense that you have older coal-fired power plants, you have coal under the ground, you have oil and gas, which obviously, if you transition to a cleaner energy sources, obviously the financial value of these assets will go down. That will have huge economic implications. So those transition risks also have to be tackled in a careful manner, especially if you're going towards decarbonization. And the risks also may arise because especially a number of countries now may start contemplating imposing border carbon tax adjustments. So if that come into play, then again, that will force some of these countries in the South Asia region to transition more quickly to the cleaner sources of energy. And again, there is a risk of stranded assets that these economies will face. And then associated risks of the financial risks and broader economic risks as well. The good news we will hear later on in the panel, of course, is not only have South Asian countries agreed to the Paris Agreement, they're so all been very proactive in terms of submission of their NDCs, but also they have a number of ambitious programs and policies in place. For example, the big push in India towards renewable energy, especially solar, the leadership that India is showing in solar, the focus on e-mobility and across the region, and also the recent pronouncements both in Pakistan coming from the Prime Minister and in Bangladesh coming from a Minister of Energy, that they would like to revisit their proposals to expand the coal-fired power plant sector. So clearly, the news coming from the region in terms of national policies is good in the sense that they all have shown an inclination to move away from coal to cleaner sources of energy. But then the challenge is, how do we get there? Well, as Stephane was mentioning, how do you go from the goal that you have to the specific policies that need to be put in place today? So there will be three phases to our proposed flagship study on decarbonization. The first phase is going to be stock taking and country engagement, in the sense that a lot is happening in these countries, both in terms of modeling. For example, India has a whole slew of models looking at the decarbonization or low carbon development. Similarly, there's an ongoing dialogue in Pakistan and in Bangladesh, for example, on transitioning to cleaner source of energy. So first task for us will be to take stock of what is out there, both in terms of ongoing policy discussion and in terms of models, and then use that opportunity to engage with the main counterparts in the countries. Because obviously, any study that we undertake will only be good to the extent it's useful for the policymakers. The second part of the study, second phase of the study will be mainly focusing on modeling aspects. We need both bottom-up modeling to understand how the energy systems work, how this transition will translate from dirtier to cleaner sources of energy. But at the same time, we need to understand the broader economic context in terms of economic growth, jobs, and the transition risk. So we need to have both a bottom-up modeling approach and a top-down approach to understand the transition, what will be the implications of this transition for these countries. And again, as Stephane was mentioning, we already have a lot of frameworks under the decarbonization pathways modeling exercise that's been done in many countries. So that's something that we can build on. And also within India, for example, there are a number of low carbon models that we can use. And finally, once we have done this top-down and bottom-up modeling, then the next step, of course, is to identify potential scenarios and opportunities for decarbonization. That would mean specific policy changes or investments that the countries need to put in place. And also, it's so important, for example, to build capacity and build coalition of the willing. For example, in Germany, they are moving quickly forward to decarbonization, but then they started with a German coal commission, which is then is going to be responsible for helping the transition, bringing the various stakeholders from the public sector, private sector, trade unions, the workers and then the various other stakeholders to kind of move that the economy in that direction on the basis of consensus and collaboration. And similarly, China recently has also announced its intentions to move towards net zero emissions by 2060. Again, it's not good enough to make an announcement. I think it's also important to follow through with putting in place mechanisms in a collaborative fashion. So that's again, that will be the final phase in terms of how do we translate the model outcomes to specific policy recommendations. So I will stop here and I look forward to the panel discussions from the various colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mani. Thank you for your presentation on the need and importance of decarbonization in the South Asia region and the associated benefits and risks and the information that you gave on the proposed study on decarbonization pathways. I would like to take this opportunity to also present Terry's work on a long-term strategy. I will now share my screen for a short presentation. So Terry has carried out work in developing two guiding frameworks for India's long-term strategy. One is on mitigation and the other is on adaptation. I present to you this work on behalf of all the co-authors of these two documents. So as mentioned earlier, the purpose of a long-term strategy is that Article 4.19 of the Paris Agreement requires all countries to formulate and communicate their long-term strategies. It is also a part of the Paris Agreement that this was to be submitted by 2020, but unfortunately, I think specifically for India, this has not been possible due to the pandemic. This long-term strategy is not legally binding, but developing a long-term strategy has several domestic and global benefits. So the boundary and scope of these two documents is that we have looked at the LTS in such a way that it should in effect fulfill two crucial criteria: that domestic developmental priorities and enhancing resilience of local communities. And India's LTS would remain incomplete without equal focus on both adaptation and mitigation. So coming to the document on mitigation, it has been developed within these 5 broad pillars, looking at the macroeconomic context, an analytical framework that uses realistic assumptions to design smart future-looking scenarios, sectoral transitional mapping to understand and classify sectors based on their ease of abatement and stage of transition, technology and financial mapping to determine the needs and the availability of sources of finance and technology, and lastly, institutional arrangements, which engages with all essential stakeholders and also encompasses effective review mechanism. So these are the key messages that arise that are part of this document. The first one is that India is still likely to have a developmental gap by 2050. India's ongoing developmental need and the global paradigm on net zero must be made compatible. This can only be done by promoting a rapid transition in the energy and industrial paradigm of development. An LTS, a long-term strategy, will serve as the best vehicle to articulate this vision for a developmental strategy that is cognizant with India's context and the conditions for India's strengthened participation in global action. An LTS would only be as strong as its institutional mechanisms. Strong policy landscaping and resource allocation mechanisms, including effective review mechanisms, are most crucial and that need to be laid out in a long-term strategy to be thoroughly implemented. On the technological and financial fronts, assessing these two needs and taking stock and building international cooperation via coalitions or bilateral and multilateral arrangements to further share technology, finance, and mobilize finance is crucial in design, not only designing a long-term strategy, but also the implementation of one. Moving on to the framework that was developed for adaptation, there are four main pillars that have been used for this. One is the developmental context, which encompasses the understanding the developmental needs based on the current growth trajectory of the country, an analytical framework which uses realistic assumptions to design smart future-looking scenarios, and resourcing adaptation that determines the needs and available sources for finance and technology. And lastly, governance of adaptation, which engages all stakeholders and encompasses monitoring, evaluation, and learning. The key messages that arise from this adaptation document are here. The LTS can be used as a tool to develop climate resilient development pathways, which encompasses a transformative approach to adaptation, which includes a systems approach that would enable development of long-term strategy that is mindful of the intersections and the continuous feedback loops that exist between different sectors. This offers a transition from incremental responses to transformational pathways that involve ambitious mitigation action and transformative adaptation practices. Linking adaptation to development and understanding vulnerabilities will form a very important basis for India specifically, since the country is heavily dependent on climate-sensitive sectors for its development. An LTS that is looking at the adaptation component of an LTS must also be based on an exhaustive understanding of current and past climate risks. This information on current and future climate will help in supporting further development of informed decision-making on adaptation and building resilience. Effective resource allocation can be achieved through effective mobilization and allocation of resources for adaptation planning through an integrated holistic approach. Assessments must be made with respect to human, social, natural, and infrastructural capital, coupled with technological and financial assessments. An LTS can only be successful with strong governance. Transformative adaptation action underscores the need for governance that reiterates the integration of institutional structures, interventions, and processes, not just across scales, but corresponding with horizontal integration as well. This slide gives a short summary on both the documents and what the essence of a strong long-term strategy would be. A long-term strategy involves developing an indicative blueprint for development, which can help align all actors in a coherent thrust towards desired outcomes for a resilient future and sustainable lifestyle in all key sectors. An LTS can encourage the alignment and coherence of policies in diverse areas, integrating environmental, social, and economic objectives. It can also help chart the country's NDCs for subsequent periods. LTS will only be effective in planning and allocation of resources that includes financial, technological, and human capabilities. Resources at these levels, The LTS may be the most convincing and comprehensive way to articulate to the community of India's ongoing developmental needs and the need for support and information sharing and technology sharing at a global scale. Embedding just transitions in an LTS would aid in socio-economic progress and building long-term resilience, as the essence of just transition lies in improving lives and livelihoods. I would like to thank you for your attention, and also I would like to thank SIF for lending their support in completing this work. Thank you so much. We will now move to the next section of our thematic track. May I now invite Ms. Neha Mukhi, who is a senior climate change specialist at World Bank. She is now building World Bank engagement to support countries on long-term decarbonization strategy. And she also works with World Bank's energy practice on climate resilient and low carbon investments in power systems in Latin America and the Caribbean. Over to you.
Thank you, Mekhala, for that excellent presentation and the work done by Terry. And also great to see a lot of interest and engagement in the region on this subject. Without any further delay, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our excellent line of panelists in front of us. We have experts and colleagues from the region. We have Mr. Ali Tawqir Sheikh, who is the former CEO of LEAD Pakistan. We have Mr. Utpal Bhattacharjee, who is the GHG mitigation expert with UNDP Bangladesh. And we have Mr. Chirag Gajjar, who is the head of subnational climate action with WRI India. And with this, we would like to get into the panel discussion where we'll be exploring a bit more of what is currently being done in the region on climate action leading up to decarbonization efforts. And at the same time, what are the emerging priorities ahead and where do the gaps lie to meet that high ambition that countries have and under the global climate framework that we are all moving towards. So we'll have 2 rounds of questions for our panelists before opening it up for audience questions. So I will just take that moment to flag for our audience to get their questions ready. As a first question, I would like to turn to Mr. Sheikh first. Mr. Sheikh, a range of partners in Pakistan, ranging from think tanks, research organizations, multi-stakeholder groups, they're helping to drive and shape the climate action in the country. We'd like to hear from you if you can provide us some insights on, what have been sort of the key engagement priorities so far, and going ahead, what do you see as the emerging, priorities, both on the policy front and on the investment side, sectoral investment sides that you see coming up in Pakistan? Mr. Sheikh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Neha, for your excellent question. And thank you. I want to thank the organizers to giving me this opportunity. Let me begin my answer with your last question, last part of your question. 3 changes are happening, and I'll mention those 3 main changes, and then I'll give some instances or examples to illustrate my point. First is that in the race to zero that has begun, or move towards decarbonization that has begun globally, it has touched Pakistan as well. And 3 changes include that climate change discourse has moved beyond Ministry of Climate Change. And also historically, an extension was of projects or interventions through NDMA to address the climate disasters or extreme events. That's one change. Second is very specific range of projects are emerging in sectors such as agriculture, water, urban planning, and particularly energy, and I'll come back to it. And third, this government has moved, present government has moved much more strongly on ecosystem-based approaches that covers both environment and to a lesser extent some mitigation or emissions part. And well-known area that many of us have heard is about the 10 billion trees plantation campaign that they launched after successfully completing 1 billion tree plantation. And second is their Clean and Green Pakistan campaign, which is offering some degree of indexing and ranking for cities in terms of their climate and environmental agenda. Now, these three, when I say that the conversation has moved beyond climate change ministry, we see that in several instances. For example, the NDC refresh now engages many other stakeholders, both in government and outside the government, donors as well as private sectors and think tank. In the energy sector, by way of example, and I'll come back to it again, Ministry of Industries and Climate Change are working very closely on EV issues and in introducing rules of business, and legislation was already introduced last year. Likewise, the climate change policy is also undergoing a revision. And then again, we see, compared to earlier, we see that other sectors that I mentioned, as well as the provinces, are getting more deeply engaged than before. And the third part that I wanted to mention is a range of projects or interventions or investments, including by World Bank, in areas of resilience and others, urban planning, and the USAID in terms of energy and electric vehicles are under implementation, or several in the pipeline. Let me come to focus a little bit something that I'm very excited about in terms of sharing with my colleagues from other countries. I can probably talk a little bit about electric vehicles in terms of specific interventions that I would imagine will interest many of you. And I'm particularly interested in this because of my own engagement with SIF. I got sensitized on the just transition issue. I wrote about it, I engaged on this issue, and I worked with the government of Pakistan to submit a GCF proposal that frames its request in just transition. And in electric vehicles context, just transition means that also focusing on two-wheelers and three-wheelers and commercial trucks. Compared to earlier conversation a year ago in this country, or 2 years ago, that focused only on vehicles, the cars. The present order, present conversation includes tax breaks. It includes a emphasis on charging infrastructure. It focuses on three-wheelers and two-wheelers, and as I mentioned, on commercial trucks. The first 5-year policy came through last year, and the government has declared that within 5 years, all 30% new sales of vehicles will be EVs by 2030 and 60% by 2035. So the plan to adapt EVs is much more ambitious, and the way technology has started moving on EVs in the country and the way the uptake has increased, I'll not be surprised, and none of us will perhaps be surprised, that the actual action on the ground could be bigger than these envisioned targets. In terms of 2 or 3 specific issues that the country is facing, on EVs, there is a major thrust from the Chinese technologies compared to the Japanese, who are favoring hybrid, by way of example, as phase 1. And the challenge is for us to consider, are we looking at transformational change, or do we wish to go slowly? And some workable formulas are under discussion, but so far it seems that smaller cars of up to 200-kilometer batteries or smaller are being favored, as are bikes and three-wheelers and school pickups and commercial trucks like Suzuki vans that are used for such purposes. Upfront costs are still a challenge. The smaller cars with batteries up to 50 kilowatt or below, or light commercials up to 150 kilowatts are preferred with 1% sales tax as a tax break. And in fact, the CKD's complete knockdown is about 6 to 8% for EVs, while it is 15 to 18% for fossil fuel based in the present dispensation system. So these things are still on the table under discussion. Some of them I've seen the day of light in terms of rule of business or taxation announcements in our financial bill. Some will probably go back and forth as it will happen. These are not. There are no concessions so far for bigger cars, even though some bigger companies have moved to have their infrastructure, charging infrastructure on our highways, on motorways, as well as in some urban centers. Rate of duty has been cut into half for the electric vehicles to about 12.5% compared to roughly 25% for the electric vehicles. And in order to promote local level assembly, the incentives are valid so long as you are doing it, but if you don't, there's a legislation to return the tax rebate, pay back to the government, and then pay the full tax and duties. So therefore, presently the scheme is to encourage 100 to 200 kilometer commuting, which is the bigger city based. I can stop here by just mentioning one or two other factors. In the present policy, to me, it seems that the effort, if the Chinese technology uptake is stronger, the motorbike owners, which are several million in this country, sorry, I don't remember the number at this time, may well graduate to between 1.2 million cars, EVs, by next 5-7 years. JVs are very much under discussion these days between local firms and other outsiders, and many of them are under discussion. So in Pakistan's energy landscape or decarbonization landscape, on the one hand, there's a very pronounced emphasis on ecosystem-based approaches, such as I mentioned, heavy tree plantation and things of this sort. On the other, not carbon sequestration, but EVs and solar are the front runners, and I didn't talk much about solar because that has been in the news for much longer, and all of us probably know more about it. I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sheikh, for sharing those insights. Indeed, very impressive to hear about the ecosystem-based approach and climate action moving beyond just the Ministry of Climate Change, which is very important to have it embedded in all economic activity. And ambitious program on the electric vehicles front, of course, which would certainly need to be complemented perhaps by the decarbonization of the supply side of the electricity supply, to ensure we can actually reap the benefit. So with that, we'll move to our second panelist, Mr. Bhattacharjee from UNDP Bangladesh. We know that UNDP is partnering with several countries, including Bangladesh, to support decarbonization efforts. It includes a range of activities on sectoral and bottom-up programs. We'd like to hear from you, Mr. Bhattacharjee.
Neha, are you there? We seem to have lost you.
because I know the questions. So
please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting and also allowing me to join in the panel discussions. So let me start with some context on Bangladesh, especially when it comes to decarbonization and going forward. I think Mr. S. Mani already covered some grounds. Bangladesh is still regarded as one of the lowest emitter, with a per capita, GHG emission intensity of 0.98 TCOT, ton per carbon dioxide. And also Bangladesh, I think in its INDC back in 2015, followed by the Paris Agreement, we expressed actually an unconditional 5% reduction on our 2012 baseline, GHG baseline, and also we have taken an additional 10% GHG emission reduction target by year 2030. And we are still passing a very nascent stage, I must say, when it comes to the actual implementation of the renewable energies, energy efficiencies to some extent, because if you look at our energy, electricity mix, I think it's purely dominated by the fossil fuel. Over nearly 98.5% is coming from natural gas, and and at least a good amount is coming from the oil, and of course a small portion is coming from the coal. But in our revised power sector master plan, we are looking forward to have more coal, as Mr. Mani already covered, and we have planned for 26 new coal power plants. And now government is sort of start revisiting the plan, just because there are a lot of pressures coming from different angles, not only from the external but also from the internal, environmental groups and the development partners, that you need to assess the fullest potential of renewables in country if possible, and to include more renewables in your forward-looking plan and the long-term strategies. So I think we have a huge declaration from our Honorable Prime Minister that we will never surpass the emission of the average emission of the developing countries, which is like 2 ton CO2 per capita or something like that. So which means we still have some room to grow, but that is why I must say our government is highly focused to adopt low carbon development, but at the same time not hampering our growth, because by 2041 we want to be a developed country, which I think is not far away. So we really have to keep moving with our development priorities and targets and all these stuffs. When it comes to UNDP's intervention, I must say UNDP has been supporting Bangladesh government in many ways. But our portfolio, when it comes to mitigation versus adaptation, I must say like over 90% of our attention is actually on adaptation than the actual mitigation. And frankly speaking, UNDP is not a heavy funder of to the project implementation like World Bank, JICA, RDB, or some other donors and development partners. But UNDP, they always try to pick projects with impact and also try to help government so that they can support through a bottom-up and as well as top-down approach. They also intervene with and support and intervene, with the right kind of policies, guidelines, and legislation, so that the sector can have the enabling framework and invite the investors for the implementation of the actual projects on ground. I can say in the last 5 years, since the introduction of Sustainable Renewable Development Authority, SREDA, I think probably you heard of this organization. We are supporting, it is a sustainable and renewable energy generation project, STRAPGEN. It's a multi-year project. And we are supporting SREDA to actually address some of the areas in the renewable energy and energy efficiency. And we have already piloted a couple of projects where we are not the sole funder. We have Jeff at our back, and also some other donors to some extent. World Bank and other donors are also involved. But the key pitch of support that we are providing Bangladesh government when it comes to renewable penetration is we are supporting government to have grid integration framework, because it is very important to accommodate and evacuate from the power plant, which has a lot of intermittency and uncertainties involved. So that is one of the big pitch of work right now we are doing. And also we help Bangladesh government to adopt net metering policy, and that really helped this sector to grow. And so far, more than 200 megawatt of distributed solar generation have been added to the utility-based system. And I hope that at least more than 500 megawatt are expected to be added within like 2-3 years down the line. When it comes to other areas of renewable, because as you know, Bangladesh is a very small country. We are a land-hungry country. Within this country, more than 180 million people are living. So we don't have a lot of space to actually install solar panels. So that is why in a very recent study, actually, it's supported by UNDP. So we have developed a solar execution roadmap for Bangladesh government. And that was eye-opening, because then policymakers start thinking if they can add 16 gigawatt solar by 2041, probably they don't need to actually fully implement all the number of coal power plants they have already planned for. Maybe they can cut at least it by 50% and 50% from the solar. And more interestingly, we are putting a lot of emphasis on the on the solar plants, on the water bodies, and on the some hilly, barren regions where there is no agricultural or other stuffs going on. And also, we are putting a lot of emphasis on the waste to energy, and also to some extent, offshore wind. But offshore wind is a very new concept. We have more than 700-kilometer coastline. So we want to harness some potential, although we know at Bay of Bengal we have a lot of wild winds. There are some ongoing studies with the support of UNDP, where we are trying to explore the potentials from offshore wind. And if offshore wind, we can tap more offshore wind, then probably we can add more ambition. And we don't yet have any long-term strategies like that India already adopted, like by 2060 or 50, they want to be net zero. But recently, we have conducted a separate assessment under C40 support, where I was involved as a consultant. And we have developed a long-term strategy and mitigation pathway modeling for Dhaka city to be carbon neutral, to be net zero by 2050. That sounds ambitious to the policymaker, but somehow they are pretty interested about this exercise and thinking whether, because Dhaka is a mega city and consuming more than 30% of the total energy supplied. So if Dhaka can be even net zero by 2050, then other cities will follow, and as a country, we'll try to also follow that pathway. So I will stop here, and of course, I will tell more in the next questions. And thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharjee. Indeed, very important points there, especially for Bangladesh, adaptation and land use management being very critical areas alongside, managing the low carbon trajectory. In fact, I think that the challenge that you described with regards to achieving development objectives while continuing to perhaps stay within some of the low carbon trajectories is the important point also that we're exploring as part of our work that Mani described for South Asia. We're exploring opportunities where countries can continue on, the trajectory to meet their economic objectives, their growth objectives, but being able to decouple those objectives with the carbon, intensity of, economic activity that helps achieve those objectives. So we'll come back to that discussion a little bit more in the second round of question. But now I'd like to turn over to Mr. Gajjar from WRI India. in India, we hear a lot of and see a lot of action on climate. Of course, we heard about the several targets that the country's put forward on clean energy, the commitments under NDC, and WRI itself is a strong partner in India and across other countries as well, working through innovative approaches like the work done through New Climate Economy, exactly on the subject of exploring decoupling of economic activity and carbon intensity. So I'd like to request you to share WRI's work on this subject in India, and especially shedding light on some of the economy-wide strategies that are being explored to help address this issue of economic growth and carbon intensity, and also if there's any work on transition risks that might be under discussion. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Neha, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this panel on very important topic of decarbonizing South Asia. I hope I'm audible. Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, great, thank you. It's my pleasure and honor to be part of this panel. For those who don't know, WRI India is an independent charity legally registered as India Resources Trust, provides objective information and practical proposals to foster environmentally sound and socially equitable development. We envision an equitable and prosperous planet driven by the wise management of natural resources. We aspire to create a world where the actions of government, businesses, and communities combine to eliminate the poverty and sustain the natural environment for all people. Thank you so much, Neha, for putting forward that question. It's an interesting question if we look at from WRI's point of view. But first of all, let's understand the kind of actions that are coming out of India, and probably India should be congratulated for some of these actions that are coming out of it. So it's ambitious NDC. We know that India has put a very ambitious NDC, as well as the target of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy, a domestic target. There's also a climate leadership that is emerging from several industrial leaders or corporate sector within India. For example, there are a number of companies who have committed to set the science-based targets, carbon neutrality targets, business ambition pledge for 1.5 degrees centigrade. There's also an effort or work going on at the subnational level as well. All the states are required to prepare their state action plan on climate change, provide their climate vision and the strategy to achieve those state action plans. There's also an effort implemented by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs for the 100 smart cities through the Smart Cities mission under the ambitious project of Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework. The framework looks at the waste management, water resource management, energy and green buildings, urban planning and green cover and biodiversity, mobility and air. These are the 5 sectors that it aims to address at the city level through and making the cities climate smart. There's also a conversation ongoing around scaling up this climate smart cities assessment framework to some of the other cities as part of the Amrit mission as well. Now, these are some of the great examples for the rest of the world to follow. Coming to the expectations from India, one can argue that the key ask, and we also heard from a couple of other presentations earlier that global community looks at India and they expect that the country should formulate a carbon neutral long-term strategy aiming for net zero. Now, some experts note that, however, India should not set its sights on economy-wide net zero target. Other experts point out that the setting an economy-wide net zero target will be extremely challenging. At the same time, sustaining the economic growth that the country aims to achieve and pulling millions out of the poverty and providing power to the millions still underserved or not served. So there is a dichotomy that is existing in the real world, which talks about what kind of approach that India should adopt. Now, if you look at the presentation from Mekhala, where she spoke about long-term strategy framework for India, both on the mitigation as well as on the adaptation side, it talks about, and to an extent, the presentation from Stephane as well. It talks about a future back approach where you're setting a vision in future where you need to be at 30, 50 years from now. And then you're using that as a goalpost to nudge your NDC or any other sectoral plans so that you're able to achieve your long-term vision. That's a future back approach. It serves the dual purpose of the dual transformation that we are hoping to aim for. Alternatively, there are interesting work that are happening at the sectoral level as well. And country could look at some of the sectors such as power and transport and could talk about net zero emissions in this particular sectors, which have better access to the effective technological solutions as compared to some of the other sectors. Exploring net zero targets in these sectors that are ready would in fact be a good move. Experts believe that it would send out strong policy signals to the businesses to act against the pollution. In fact, if you look at India's second biennial update report, the emissions growth in the transport sector is outpacing the emissions growth in the energy sector, and it's going very fast. So it's important for the country to identify these key sectors which it can address and talk about economy-wide net zero emissions in the respective sectors. Now, let's also understand a couple of other things that India is undergoing the transition. For example, energy transition is already underway. The renewable energy goals adopted by India are driving this transition and will continue to influence the actions in the energy sector. If anything, the recent announcement of hydrogen energy mission to focus on green hydrogen production is an indication that India is looking at accelerated decarbonization of its energy sector. A lot of private sector, a lot of subnational governments are also focusing on the transformation or the transition of the energy sector. And the second thing I would like to point out is India is urbanizing. If you look at UNDESA projections or estimates, some of the largest cities of the world will be in India by 2040 or by 2050, which means that India is urbanizing and urbanizing very fast and will sort of overtake some of the Indian cities will overtake some of the global cities like Tokyo and other cities. More importantly, this urban transition will drive the demand for energy and transport services along with other services that urban areas need to cater to the population or the communities in those areas. This is an opportunity to grow in a sustainable manner. Now is the time to plan and ensure that we don't get locked into a high carbon infrastructure. The third thing that I want to talk about is the jobs transition that will be driven by the transitions in some of the other sectors like energy as well as the urban transition. And I think Dr. Mani also briefly touched upon the jobs transition sector as well. The point that I want to make is that India can significantly boost the employment through the power sector by increasing the share of renewables. The renewable energy sector can employ more than 3.2 million people by 2050 and could be the largest employee in the future Indian power sector. According to a study conducted by Co-Benefits released in September last year, the renewable energy sector could employ 5 times more people by 2050 than the entire Indian fossil fuel sector employs today. So this is an important development that we need to consider. Now, any transition that requires, any transition that happens requires planning in either at the sectoral level or at the geographic level to ensure that the planning is inclusive in nature. What do I mean by inclusive is that there are 3 different levels of inclusivity. One is the inclusivity of the policy, that the people are at the center of the policy making. The second is the inclusivity of the process, that all impacted stakeholder groups are involved in the process. And third is the inclusivity of the impact, that the planning leads to an equitable distribution of the impact of climate action programs or policies that are being formulated. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to come back and provide more inputs. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for those very insightful remarks and, sharing the range of initiatives currently underway and the new priorities, especially we heard on the hydrogen mission, the green hydrogen mission, which of course clearly chart out the direction that India is headed in. I think the sort of challenges that we are hearing with regards to just transition are very valid, and emerging trends on transport and urbanization trends. And those are some of the challenges I guess we'll be hearing and trying to grapple with as the countries are moving forward. Now, as a second question round, I'd like to pose a common question for all our panelists, which is, and we'd appreciate your remarks on that based on the country engagements that you have in the region. The main thing, what is something that's very clear from the discussion so far, that climate action efforts are underway, and significantly accelerating in countries, in all the countries in the region, in Pakistan, and from the countries that we're hearing today, in India and Bangladesh. But still, as we are hearing, is getting to a decarbonization plan, keeping in line, keeping in mind and sight the economic and social objectives that the countries have. That is still hard and a struggle for countries to put together or embark on. So we've heard some of the hurdles and the key areas that you've expanded on. It would be good to hear your reflections on how do you think some of these could be addressed? How do you think countries could grapple with some of these issues? So maybe we'll go back around with the same sequence, starting with Mr. Sheikh from Pakistan. Mr. Sheikh, you're on mute.
Can I come as second commentator? I'm just trying to organize my papers in the meanwhile.
Certainly, no worries. In that case, I will invite Mr. Bhattacharjee or Mr. Gajjar if you'd like to weigh in.
If you allow, I can weigh in.
Yes, please.
So first of all, the thing when it comes to decarbonization, of course, decarbonization means a lot when not only decarbonizing your national electricity grid, but also you have to improve on the primary energy side, as well as in the some other areas where we are extensively utilizing or using the fossil fuel. So it seems like a heavily conditional growth agenda for many of the countries, because not all the countries are of the same level of potential when it comes to renewable and energy efficiency, and also the economic parity. So Bangladesh, in our country, we have identified at least now a good number of hurdles. I think that is sort of inhibiting us to go for that kind of ambitious actions. First of all, we do not have a lot of internal resources to finance the projects that will ultimately hugely decarbonize our electricity systems. We have aging infrastructures, and also most of the infrastructure plannings are based on, are actually without the consideration of decarbonizing in the near term or in the long term way. And also, if you look at our, if you look at our previous NDC, we have taken, we have taken targets on the actions that we think will be able to deliver within 2030, and sounds like these were not very ambitious. But this time, from UNDP with our global agenda to support the developing country to update their NDC, we are sort of sensitizing Bangladesh government so that more ambitious mitigation actions can be undertaken in the NDC2. I actually tell it as NDC2, so that more country-driven actions can be taken, more renewable can be included with a vision to decarbonize or offset our electricity systems, and also bring some other potentials forefront. And also, as I mentioned, and also Gajjar mentioned, some of the cities are highly urbanizing. I am not only talking about Dhaka, but we have 4 other divisional cities are highly urbanizing. So, and if these cities are not given access to the renewable energy or energy efficiency measures like building lighting scheme or the heat envelope systems, the improvement on their HVAC systems. And also, if you look at our transportation systems, still it's highly dependent on the fossil fuel. So if we want to decarbonize, I mean, we really need to look at all these areas very thoughtfully, and we have to come up with strategies and forward-looking action plan so that we can not only address the issue or challenges, but also to step by step we take actions and program so that we can achieve some measurable improvement along the way. And if you look at, I mean, this time we are updating our NDC, and we are passing very hard time because it's a country-driven process. We really need to engage a lot of stakeholders, and most of the stakeholders are private sector, where they need a lot of incremental financing to undertake projects, and also they need improved technology. So I think as country, how we are going to combat this challenge will actually ensure whether by when we will really be able to fully decarbonize our grid electricity-based systems or other uses of electricity or liquid fuel. So I will stop here, but of course I would like to input more if needed. Thank you, Neha.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very useful. And with that, I will turn it over to our other panelists and see who'd like to go next. Mr. Sheikh, go ahead, please.
Thank you for giving me the second opportunity to make the first impression. I think I need to go back to what Stephane said that was extremely important. Having a longer vision to 2050 and then building it back is very important. And when we build back, I think my friend Mani will know nothing is more important in South Asia's history than 2047 when these three countries became independent. So when we build back, there are two or three things that come to my mind. At least in Pakistan's sense, I know that almost half of our emissions come from agriculture and livestock. How do we begin to address them? They may not necessarily be a low-lying fruit, but this is an important nut to crack. When it comes to actual energy, we know very well that disruptive technologies will become mainstream much faster than we had envisioned. And we've seen the trend in the graphs that were presented to us. It will come in the storage as well as the efficiency of solar and wind technologies, hydrogen and so forth. But it's very important to phase out of coal. Our plans need to not postpone our actions to 2040 or 2050, but see what needs to be done between 2020 and 2020. And I see encouraging commitments coming from regional countries, but I think we need to put them on a certain timeline that how we will improve our energy mix year by year by year. I know the addiction of coal is very deep in several countries. And at the same time, we also know that renewable will create more jobs than the coal. And we also know the concepts, as we saw in the long-term strategy document, how the just transition can help us address the lives and livelihoods of those who are depending on them. But personally, because it's a flagship study, if I have to influence it by saying one thing, it does not necessarily mean that we subsidize the coal mines, per se, for phasing out. We commit to the lives and livelihoods of the workers there. But if the subsidies must come, they must come for renewable energy, not for phasing out of coal. And there's a fine distinction that needs to be understood. And having a closer look at Poland, Germany, and Central European countries can be very, very instructive in this regard. And the final point that I want to make is that NDC, at least in Pakistan, is an orphan document. Submitted the first one without necessarily having a global template. And now we are doing the same thing again to UNFCCC.
I'm sorry, sir. I think you're on mute.
Hope you heard me earlier.
No.
We missed the last part.
Last point.
Just the last part.
Last part is that NDC is a bogus document. It does not give you a roadmap for 50 years. UNFCCC did not have the teeth or the vision to create a template for the countries to follow, both conditional and unconditional deliverables. Now, the World Bank is considering of having a decarbonization plan for a particular region, it's our region, let's say, these 3 countries or others. I think we need to have a clear vision that how we'll proceed and how our second and third and fourth revision of NDC will be aligned. Otherwise, these will be parallel documents, and we already have quite a few parallel documents which have no utility, but we end up investing lots of time on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sheikh. Very important points there on the role of instruments, economic instruments and incentives to help integrate clean technologies and how to have more robust transition plans in phasing out coal as opposed to using some instruments that may not be effective. And well noted on the importance of having plans and documents that are put to well implementation as opposed to just having a note that sits on the shelf. But with that, I will turn over to Mr. Gujjar for his remarks in response to the question.
Well, thank you so much, Neha. A peculiar challenge in India for climate policy planning is that of scale. Now, truly effective decarbonization efforts necessitate that concerted action at both national and subnational levels are happening, ensuring that the state, city, and local level authorities take ownership of implementation of mitigation policies as well as adaptation policies and decisions taken by the national government. Furthermore, whether it is to fulfill the international commitments or to decrease the risk of expensive lock-in of carbon intensive infrastructure, the time planning of the long-term strategies or the long-term vision compels the country to look much beyond 2030, which typically goes beyond the sectoral planning time horizons at the national and the subnational level. So you see, typically at the subnational level, you would have around 2 to 5 years of planning that takes place, whereas the long-term vision requires much beyond 2030 horizon. Now, coming back to the LTS point of view, there are several non-governmental actors, including research organizations, that are independently undertaking studies on the long-term planning for India. Current models and the analytical approaches that are used commonly have several shortcomings. For example, most current models are inadequate when it comes to realistically modeling the diffusion of new technologies, incorporating structural changes in the economy within the model over the long term, modeling the collective effects of different policies acting in combination, policy overlaps, ability to optimize the socioeconomic benefits when developing pathways, among others. Now, these are all very important factors from the perspective of planning for the long-term time frames. Of course, you would need a co-creation of a modeling approach which would enable you to incorporate some or few of these factors in the short term, and then subsequently you'll have to revisit some of these modeling approaches at a periodic intervals to ensure that most of the concerns or factors are considered. In terms of the sectoral transitions towards decarbonization have enormous potential to boost India's economy and improve the well-being of the income of millions of Indians. For example, I'll take the same example of power and transport sector transition towards decarbonization through wide-scale implementation of RE technology, energy efficiency, infusion of zero-emission vehicles. It can improve access to reliable, affordable, and sustainable electricity, reduce the number of premature deaths related to air pollution, which is one of the biggest issues in India, decongest the cities, reduce the healthcare costs for the government, ensure energy security, not just for the urban areas, but also for the rural areas as well, and simultaneously smash the fossil fuel import bills for the country, which is heavily dependent on the fossil fuels. It can also boost the profits of small and large businesses alike. So there are multiple benefits of looking at the sectoral transitions, which are running in parallel with the long-term vision or the long-term strategy of the country. Now, one of the good news that has come out recently from India is Government of India has constituted an apex committee for implementation of the Paris Agreement. The committee comprises of 17 members from 14 different ministries or departments, including environment, finance, agriculture, science and technology, new and renewable energy, water resources, power, earth sciences, health, housing and urban affairs, rural development, external affairs, commerce and industry, and Niti Aayog as well. This is a welcome move, which will enable a coordinated response on climate change from the country. It will enable different levels of governments within India to coordinate response and inform the country's strategy. Now, India was on track to achieve 2 of its 3 quantified NDC targets, or is rather on track to achieve 2 of its 3 quantified NDC targets, including the intensity of GDP target. This demonstrated to the world that economic growth and bold action on climate change go hand in hand. I'll stop here and happy to come back if there are any questions.
Thank you, Chirag. In terms of the importance of laying out the long-term vision with that objective in mind, because so far a lot of our efforts in this area have been focused on the short to medium-term perspective, which in many cases can miss the long-term picture and the emerging trends across growing economies that we have in the region. As we are waiting for some questions to be posed by the audience, and I see there's some coming up, but I'll take this opportunity to put forward a thought-provoking idea here and see if we have some reactions from our excellent panelists. And it would be great to hear from you. We've heard a lot about technology integration, cutting-edge technology, and the role of economic and policy instruments here. I think what we are seeing as an emerging area for a lot of countries in this space is the growing role of financial sector to help bring about the transition, in fact, a transformation that's much needed. But I think we are still waiting for that to come about in India or in the region more broadly. So it would be great to hear some reflections from you on, are we seeing financial sector becoming active with regards to the financial stability risks that might be posed by some of the assets, the carbon intensive assets that we have in the country, the investments that are currently there, and how they could potentially be stranded, leading to stranded assets based on what the policy environment, the international policy environment might be, other countries adopting targets, and also, frankly, global investors, putting forward statements with regards to climate disclosures and environmental and social governance frameworks being integrated into investment decision making. So I know this is an area that's just sort of emerging now, and I'm kind of taking everybody off guard, but it would be great to hear from your perspective. what is the role that financial sector can play in the region with bringing about decarbonization and transformation of systems? I'll invite volunteers again.
Yeah, maybe I can go first. I'll try to give you an example, and this may not directly give you an answer, but sort of gives you a perspective of how the thinking is evolving over a period of time. So in India, there is a challenge called City Investments to Integrate, Innovate, and Sustain. It's a challenge jointly run by French Development Agency and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. In the first version of the challenge, roughly 25 to 30 cities participated. There were several projects that were shortlisted, and about 10 to 12 projects were sort of given the loans as part of this particular challenge. Now the challenge is being re-looked at, and after the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework was introduced by the ministry, and the challenge is now integrating the climate components to mainstream the climate aspects into the projects that will be awarded as part of the Cities 2.0 challenge. So yes, to answer your question in simplistic manner, the financial institutions or the financing agencies are becoming aware of the climate considerations or the risk that the climate change poses to several of the communities or the infrastructure projects that they invest in, and they are being forthcoming in addressing some of those issues. Now, the way this challenge works is it involves 3 different levels of the governance within India itself. So there's a national government, which has a direct engagement with the French Development Agency. There's a specific purpose vehicle created as part of the smart city at the city level. And then there is a state government which is involved, which also plays an important role because the state also has a state action plan and a vision to achieve certain aspects. So the SPV that comes up with a project would also need to contribute to the regional goals and vision as well. So you see, there is an effort to align the activities and the vision at different levels, which results in reduction or addressing of the risk that the climate change poses.
Thank you, Chirag, for that perspective. Very informative. I'd like to invite other panelists to share their thoughts on this. Mr. Sheikh, yes, please go ahead. You're on mute, Mr. Sheikh.
I want to bring in the private sector in its role. We know that globally and in these countries, climate change, in these countries, private sector has invested more than governments. We know that decision-making is fast. We know that we need to create jobs, and we know that they are driven by efficiencies and bottom lines. I want to be particularly keen to mention the role of small and medium enterprises in this. We can create small level jobs, and I want to give you 2 or 3 examples from Pakistan. The sports industry in one of Pakistan cities that produces sports items, particularly football matches, match-grade footballs. Their associations started seeing if they can have their own solar mini-grid and do not rely on government. And of course, the upfront cost is higher for them, but then they have been discussing with the banks to see if their propositions can be bankable. And they looked at the viability of their project to the extent of even calculating rooftop space for the photovoltaic cells on their rooftops. So that's how, by way of one example, I am aware of one joint venture that is looking at 2 business options, and they have the equity, and they'll be looking at finances and some fintech and other companies can come in this, is to see whether or not from Karachi to Peshawar, that's over 1,000 miles, if they can have franchise battery servers for the truckers to use their batteries instead of fossil fuel, and they'll have battery disposal or replacement outlets available at 4 or 6 locations on this 1,000-mile long stretch to see if they can bring the transportation level down. And now, one of the biggest thing is that most of Afghanistan's trade happens through Pakistan, and our road, GT road, that you also have in India, is oftentimes crowded by these expensive transportation mechanism, and solar is one way to bring down the global competitiveness also in regional trade, if that is possible, if I can give that example. I wanted to give you one more example whereby also I think it's already happening in India as well, whereby motorbikes can be produced at a very, very competitive rate with some replaceable batteries. So we are looking at the possibility if rickshaws or three-wheelers, if the cost could be cut into 1/3 and the battery service could be provided to them from the stations where they can, because the charging times are much longer and therefore it's not at this point viable to think of longer commute. So this shorter distance or finding ways to shorter distance and see how EVs can have these smaller guys for transition, for just transition, because three-wheelers are typically in congested areas. They are the typical victims of high pollution levels and victims of asthma and all other health-related disease. So that's the context. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sheikh. Over to you, Mr. Bhattacharjee.
Sorry, yeah, I was struggling to unmute myself. Anyway, Neha, I would like to slightly, take a different way to answer or respond to your question. The thing is, if you look at our financing institutions, not only in Bangladesh, of course, in general across all the South Asian countries, so they have a typical mindset, when they want to finance a project, they first want to see whether that project is bankable, whether that project can really generate enough cash flow in future so that they can get the return and all these stuffs. But if you look at the Western countries, especially I have seen in many states in USA, particularly in Colorado, with Excel Energy. So if utility, if they want to implement a coal-based power plant or even a gas-based power plant, first they need to show asset retirement fund that is sufficiently in place to take care of the stranded asset. If there is any legislative action would be introduced either state-wise or from the federal government, and there is enough resources on that thing. Otherwise, they won't even get the financing. So do we have that kind of mechanism in place in our financing systems to take care of that thing? And also in India, you have a lot of active bond markets to support the infrastructure projects, especially in energy. It could be green, it could be brown, or it could be equity or whatever. But it's a quite vibrant bond market in place. But in our country, we are yet to develop that bond market to locally source the financing that is required to actually, to address these issues. Otherwise, in the banking due diligence system, you don't have component to address the recourse of the stranded asset. Probably that typical mindset is not going to be changed. And most of the financing agency in our country is pretty skeptical when it comes to renewable, while saying we don't have enough knowledge on conducting due diligence on the wind or the solar or to some extent biomass projects. I struggled a lot even to source finance for only a 14 megawatt utility scale biomass projects, and the reply I was getting from all that financial institutions is that we never finance this kind of projects. How could you even think that we'll finance 100 million to a project that we have no track on? So I think from the financial policy side, if the central government or the central government bank, if they don't come up with the appropriate policies or enabling framework to sensitize these financing sources so that they can be directed towards implementing or financing the renewable or energy efficiency projects, probably the situation is not going to be changed. Or the well, we will take a lot of we'll come up with a lot of innovative policies, measures under our NDC to decarbonize the grid, but probably that's not going to happen.
Thank you, Utpal. That was very important point that you raised, the role of these in financial instruments in markets where that can be used to finance large-scale clean technology or clean infrastructure, green infrastructure, and especially the point on the role of financing institutions to integrate some of these requirements and considerations as part of their, financing guidelines on assets, sort of end of life and asset retirement, arrangements, funds. Yes. So thank you for that. This is very important. And we're seeing more and more that of that thinking emerge in global financial institutions coming forward. We have a few questions from the audience that I'd like to put out for our panelists and also our presenters. A couple of questions. I'll put forward the questions and give you an opportunity to think about it. We may not have much time to go for another round, but what are, in your expert opinion, what are the most important means of achieving decarbonization, particularly in developing countries? That's one question, and that's a bit broad-based question, and I think a lot of panelists have talked towards it, but maybe something that you have not been able to cover so far. Second, do you think developed countries could play a role in accelerating decarbonization in South Asia region, and what that role could look like? Another question is about the possible potential stranded assets in the region. Are there any estimates of stranded assets, potential stranded assets for countries in the region in South Asia? And if there's been any global analytical work or regional analytical work around that space? And I think with that, that'll be the three questions that we've received from the audience, and I'll open it up for all our three panelists, and I know we have Mani and Mekhala as the other presenters as well.
I'll be very brief, but let me start with the question number 2. So if you look at the conditional part of our NDC target, which is heavily reliant on the external supports for the implementation, I think where Western countries or even the emerging GCF or the other sources can really help the necessary support, the financing support, so that the countries, South Asian countries can actually support or help or have the right help to actually achieve the conditional target. And I mean, if you talk about the stranded assets, probably you have plans, I think, in India that they have already expired. They're about to be expired by now. Already in the field, generating field for more than 80 years. So if you want to go for the baseline assessment of the stranded assets, probably you won't get the right value of those assets. So I think, yeah, your approach is right. I think if we can have an estimate on the stranded asset, probably then we can come up with the right strategy for the financial institutions, and especially from the in the policy side. That what would be the recourse of these stranded asset, and how the new asset that is going to be built post 2020 would take care if there is sufficient change or remarkable changes in the future policy direction regarding decarbonization. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Utpal. I see Mani would like to come in on the question. Go ahead, yes, please.
Yeah, so I would like to take this question about what the Western countries can do to help South Asia decarbonize in the near future. But I was actually turned the question around. I think it's most important that we don't look to West anymore, but we should probably look towards China. China has committed itself to reduce its carbon emissions and also go carbon neutral by 2060. Now, the benefits of solar and wind technologies that we are enjoying today is to a large extent because of the huge investments made by China, which brought the prices down. So similarly, if China goes aggressively towards decarbonization by investing in not only renewable technologies, but also in things like electric vehicles and other cleaner tech, hydrogen fuel, and so on and so forth, I think the whole world will benefit, including South Asian countries. So I think the whole world should look to China in the next 10 years, how they actually start implementing their goal of reaching a net zero emission target by 2050 or 2060, and that will change the whole landscape because that will have huge implications in terms of the cost of decarbonization that we will experience in South Asia.
Thank you, Mani. And I see Mekhala would like to come in as well.
I was going to answer the same question on what can the developed world do. It's like I mentioned in my presentation, decarbonization in India and of course in South Asia as well would require immense technological and financial investments. So that is one area in which there is a need for collaboration and not just collaboration and sharing at both levels. I would also like to remind you that we are quite late into the session and we must close soon.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Mekhala. I think we have a lot of interest from the audience, but this is a dialogue to be continued, not to be wrapped up with the end of this session. And I see one question with regards to last question that we'll take is with regards to the link between gender and decarbonization, and would it further marginalize South Asian women? I think there are several opportunities, the decarbonization opportunities that are win-win-win on so many perspectives, economic, environment, and social, that can help achieve those objectives. Not just, for examples, the clear ones that come to our mind around agriculture and especially in the water arena, in the water sector, where not only these sectors have a huge environmental footprint and a carbon footprint, but at the same time impact livelihoods, especially disproportionately impacting women in the region, given their role in this space, in these economic sectors. So, of course, introducing these decarbonization approaches can help with those social objectives as well. And perhaps we can start with a note to self here with a better representation of women on policy dialogues, including a panel such as this. And with that note, I guess I will pass it over to our colleagues at TERI for the final closing part of the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Neha. I am going to invite my colleague, Abhishek Kaushik, to close this session for us.
Thanks, Mekhala, and thank you all. Let me, on behalf of TERI, join Mr. Rashmi to thank the World Bank Group for supporting this event and extending their continued support to the World Sustainable Development Summit. Unfortunately, Dr. A.K. Jain would not be able to join us for the closing remarks, but he shared his best wishes to all of us, and maybe in the future course of time, he will be joining us for the discussions around decarbonization. With this, I would also like to thank all the panelists, especially Neha, for moderating this so efficiently, although we ran out of time, but I see a lot of interest from the audience, and we will take all the questions maybe after the session and share it among the panelists to respond to it. I would also like to thank Mr. Stephane Hallegatte for presenting the framework for deep decarbonization pathways, and Dr. Mani for presenting possible approaches. And I would like to finally thank Mr. Rashmi for his welcome remarks and setting the context. With this, I would like to thank all of you to joining us today, and we look forward to this continuous engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.